It began, as many tragedies do, with a banquet meant to impress. The great hall of Lyons-la-Forêt glittered with torchlight, shadows dancing across stone walls heavy with winter damp. The air was rich with the smells of roasted meats, honeyed wine, and something far stranger, something from the sea that did not belong so far inland. On the high table sat King Henry I of England, broad of shoulder, silver in hair, his eyes sharp with the stubborn pride of a man who had ruled for decades without yielding to counsel or fate. Before him lay a silver platter heaped with lampreys, eels, slick and dark as oil, their small round mouths ringed with teeth like tiny saws. They were his favorite indulgence, a delicacy forbidden to him by his own physicians. Too rich, too dangerous, they had warned. But Henry had never been a man to deny himself. Courtiers watched in silence as he ate, tearing into the glistening flesh with slow, deliberate bites. Each mouthful was washed down with wine until the eels were gone, and only a dark sheen of sauce clung to the plate. Somewhere in the corner, the royal physician lowered his eyes. He knew what was coming. No one could yet smell the shadow of death that would follow the bloated belly, the poisoned blood, the nights of agony. No one yet knew that this feast would not be remembered for its splendor, but for the way it marked the beginning of the end. And so the hall laughed and drank, unaware that the king was already swallowing his last days whole.
The hall was alive that night in a way only winter feasts could be. Outside, the snow lay heavy on the eaves, muffling the world in white silence. Inside, the fire roared and the tables groaned under trenchers of venison, game birds, and wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. Yet all of it, the bread warm from the oven, the roasted boar glistening with honey glaze, existed only as a frame for the true centerpiece, the king's beloved lampreys. They had come from the river Seine that very morning, still twisting in their wicker baskets, their skin wet and cold as if they had swallowed pieces of the river's winter. The royal cooks had bled them in bowls of salt water, gutted them with small knives, then stewed them in wine and a broth thickened with almonds. A final touch, a dusting of cinnamon from the Levant, so precious it could ransom a knight, turned the dish into something closer to sacrament than supper. The courtiers, seated in long rows beneath banners embroidered with lions and fleurs-de-lis, watched with trained faces. There were always whispers about the king's appetite for these creatures, whispers that skipped between respect and quiet fear. Some claimed lampreys were a royal taste, reserved for the strong of constitution. Others muttered they were cursed, that too much of them soured the blood. Henry himself sat like a man carved from oak, his heavy frame wrapped in a cloak lined with sable. Age had thickened his hands, but there was no hesitation as he speared another segment of the soft, dark flesh and lifted it to his mouth. He spoke little, only pausing to drink deep from a goblet of red wine, its rim flecked with droplets of the lamprey's oily sauce. One of his stewards, a lean man named Robert de Seguillo, tried to make light conversation. "My lord," he said, "they say in Normandy the lamprey is the very food of kings. Surely no common man could stomach so fine a dish." Henry's eyes, small but sharp, crinkled at the edges. "Then may they never try," he replied, his voice dry as parchment. The table laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that waits for permission. As the meal went on, the platters emptied and fresh ones arrived as if the kitchen were an inexhaustible spring. Henry ate more than most men could have managed in 2 sittings. Each mouthful seemed to tighten the warmth in his cheeks, deepen the shine in his eyes. He felt the heaviness in his belly, yes, but it was the pleasant weight of victory, the same sensation he had known after a battle won or a treaty forced at sword point. Yet there was a moment, fleeting as a moth's shadow, when the king's face slackened. It happened as he reached for another piece. His hand trembled ever so slightly, and his breath caught in his throat. He waved it away with a grunt, swallowing the bite and taking another long draught of wine. No one spoke of it, but a few noticed. In the high rafters, smoke from the torches curled into black ribbons, mingling with the smell of meat and wine and the faint sour tang of the lampreys. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere far from the warmth of the feast, wolves cried in the frozen forest. Inside, Henry laughed again, but the sound was just a shade too loud, the echo a touch too long, like a man laughing to drown out some quiet, uninvited thought. By the time the last platters were cleared and the fire burned low, the king's belly was round with his indulgence, his eyes glassy in the torchlight. He rose slowly, leaning on the arm of a servant. "I will sleep well tonight," he said, though his voice had grown hoarse. The hall emptied. The cold outside seemed to press against the walls, listening.
Henry retired to his private chambers in the keep at Lyon-le-Forêt, the stone walls lit only by a scatter of torches that hissed in the cold draught. The servants had drawn thick woolen curtains against the night and stoked the hearth until the fire's glow licked the beams overhead. His bed, a massive structure of carved oak, was already warmed with copper pans filled with embers. The king sat heavily upon it, unbuckling the sword at his side. The leather straps creaked, the steel whispered as it left the scabbard. A squire took it reverently, bowing as he backed away. Then came the slow removal of his boots, his cloak, his fur-lined tunic. Every layer peeled away revealed not vigor, but the weight of his years. His body was still broad and solid, but the skin beneath was pale and loose, the flesh marbled in ways no feast could disguise. He dismissed most of the attendants with a flick of his hand. Only 2 remained, a valet to tend the fire and a physician summoned at the king's own request. The physician, Master Gilbert, was a cautious man, schooled in the remedies of Salerno and the humors of Galen. He carried a leather satchel smelling of vinegar and rosemary, his tools clinking faintly within. "My lord," Gilbert began, bowing low, "shall I prepare a draught for your rest?" Henry waved him closer. "It is nothing," he said, though his voice was taut. "A heaviness in the stomach. Perhaps the wine was strong." But it was not the wine. As the hours dragged, the heaviness grew into a clawing pressure that curled beneath his ribs. A bitter taste rose in his throat, and his skin shone with an unnatural heat despite the chill of the chamber. Gilbert felt the king's pulse, frowned, and whispered to the valet to bring more light. The torches cast long shadows that trembled on the walls. In their flicker, Henry's face seemed to sharpen, the cheekbones more pronounced, the mouth set in a thin line. Sweat gathered at his temples, sliding down into the furrows of his cheeks. He shifted on the bed, restless, as though some invisible weight pressed on him. Gilbert produced a pewter cup, pouring into it a dark liquid that smelled of mint and iron. "For the humors, sire, it will draw the heat downward," he said. The king drank, grimacing, and lay back. But rest would not come. His thoughts, already muddied by the discomfort in his gut, turned in strange, sharp circles. He thought of the lampreys, their cold, slick bodies writhing in the basket, their eyeless heads cut away. He imagined them whole again, alive and moving, somewhere deep within him.
A treacherous whisper in his mind told him they were still feeding. The hours deepened. Outside, snow slid from the roof in muffled thuds. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the king's uneven breathing. Once, he lurched upright, clutching at his chest, his eyes wide with something close to fear. Gilbert steadied him, murmuring about digestion and imbalance of humors, but the king barely heard. By the darkest hour, the fire had sunk to embers. Henry's hands gripped the bedclothes so tightly his knuckles were white. The pain had shifted lower, stabbing and twisting. There was no comfortable position. Every movement seemed to stir the turmoil within. Gilbert looked into the king's face and saw something he had not seen before, not in this man who had ruled with iron for decades. Vulnerability. It lay there, naked in the way Henry's eyes searched his physicians for answers he could not give. In the hall below, the guards spoke in low voices, aware that something was wrong but bound by their station to wait for summons. The keep itself seemed to listen, its stones holding their breath. When dawn approached, Henry was still awake. The world outside began to pale, but in the king's chamber, time had stopped. Every heartbeat was a hammer against the walls of his body. Every breath a reminder that something inside him had shifted in the night, something that would not be undone.
The winter morning crept in like a thief, its light dim and indifferent. Frost patterned the edges of the chamber windows, but within the air was heavy, stifling. The fire had been revived, yet its warmth was no comfort. Henry lay propped against a mound of pillows, his face drawn and waxy, his lips tinged the faintest blue. Servants moved in hushed urgency. Bowls of steaming broth were carried in, herbs were crushed and boiled, cups of strange dark infusions placed at the bedside. Master Gilbert knelt beside the king, his fingers pressed to the swollen belly. He could feel the tension in the flesh, as if some internal tide was swelling upward, threatening to breach. Henry tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "The lampreys," he muttered, "they bite still." His hand trembled as it brushed his abdomen. The words chilled the room. No one dared correct him. The pain, once a deep gnawing, had sharpened into waves that came without warning. At times they seized his whole body, his legs jerking beneath the covers, his teeth clenching hard enough that the muscles in his jaw ached. His eyes, normally sharp even in anger, now darted about, unfocused, as if chasing shapes only he could see. Rumors began to coil through the keep. A page swore he heard the king groaning through the stone walls. A maid claimed she saw him retch into a basin, the contents streaked with black. Outside, the snow-covered courtyard was strangely still. Huntsmen and couriers kept their distance. None wished to be too close to a king in decline. Gilbert, in desperation, ordered a poultice of mustard seed and vinegar to be placed on the king's belly, its sharp scent filling the chamber. The skin reddened under its heat, but the relief was fleeting. The king's breath came faster, more shallow. He began to shiver, despite the piled furs. "Send for the bishop," Gilbert murmured to a squire. The young man froze, knowing what such a request implied. Henry, half-conscious, seemed to drift in and out of the present. At times, he muttered fragments of commands as though still presiding over a court. At others, his words sunk into a darker realm. "Cold mouths," he whispered once. They take the warmth from me, piece by piece. By mid-afternoon, his skin gleamed with sweat, soaking the linen beneath him. The room reeked of vinegar, herbs, and the sour tang of sickness. Flies, drawn by the heat and the scent, gathered near the window despite the cold beyond. Gilbert tried bleeding him, the ancient cure for imbalance. But the blood that flowed was sluggish, dark, and strangely thick. The physician's face was calm, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Outside the chamber, the bishop arrived, robes trailing across the stone floor. He entered quietly, his eyes falling on the king, once a figure of absolute power, now pale and trembling, his breath uneven. He knelt to pray, the low Latin murmurs weaving through the crackle of the fire. Henry opened his eyes briefly. "Is it so soon?" he asked. The bishop did not answer directly, only pressed the sign of the cross against the king's forehead. As the shadows lengthened, the pain reached a cruel peak. Henry gripped the edges of the bed, every muscle straining. His jaw slackened in a gasp, then clenched again. The lampreys, real or imagined, seemed to coil tighter inside him, each spasm a reminder of the feast that had begun this descent. The keep seemed to darken, as though the day itself was reluctant to witness what would come next. And still, through the haze of agony, the king clung to the thin thread of his will, though the thread frayed with every passing breath.
Night fell heavy over the keep, swallowing what little warmth the day had left. The wind outside howled through the arrow slits, carrying the scent of snow and distant smoke. Inside, every torch flickered low, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The king's chamber had become a place of vigil and of dread. Henry lay still, his eyes half-lidded, yet his breath betrayed him, ragged, shallow, each inhale a labor. The fever had stolen his strength, but it had also burned something wild into his gaze. At moments, he seemed to see beyond the stone walls, beyond the winter, beyond even the kingdom he ruled. The bishop remained at the foot of the bed, his murmurs constant. Servants hovered near the walls, clutching basins, cloths, and cups of wine diluted with herbs. No one drank from those cups but the king, and now even he turned away. The thought of swallowing anything seemed to pain him. From time to time, a convulsion gripped his body, twisting his features into a grimace. A guttural sound escaped his throat, somewhere between a groan and a growl. His hands clawed at the bedclothes, gripping so tightly his knuckles turned white. Gilbert tried to soothe him, dabbing his lips with cool water, but Henry recoiled as though the touch burned. Outside the chamber, the courtiers whispered. Some spoke of divine punishment, that the lamprey feast had been a sin of arrogance, a mockery of moderation. Others muttered of poison. An invisible dagger slipped into the king's banquet. But none dared say these things aloud within earshot of the royal guard. The king stirred. "Do you hear them?" His voice was a rasp, his eyes darting toward the rafters. "In the dark, they speak." Gilbert glanced upward, seeing nothing but shadows shifting with the torchlight. Henry's gaze fixed on an empty space, his lips trembling. "They wait for me." The bishop pressed the crucifix into Henry's palm. The king clutched it as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world. His breathing slowed, then surged in painful bursts, each one sounding as though it might be the last. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its below felt distant, unreachable. The air was heavy with the mingled smells of damp wool, spilt wine, and the sourness of sickness. Somewhere outside, a bell tolled the hour. The sound seemed to make Henry shudder. As the night deepened, his moments of lucidity grew fewer. He spoke to figures who were not there: his father, his long-dead brother, faces from campaigns past. Once, his expression softened, and he reached out into the air as though touching someone's cheek. Then his features twisted again in pain, the ghost replaced by the teeth of memory. Gilbert leaned close, whispering prayers and encouragement, though he knew they could no longer turn the tide. The king's pulse fluttered under his touch like a trapped bird. Every moment felt stretched, suspended, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Near midnight, Henry's eyes opened one last time with clarity. "Keep the crown," he said, "but guard the heart. It is the first to fall." Then, as if those words were the last tether, he sank back into the pillows. The torches hissed softly as their oil burned low. The bishop crossed himself, and in that dim chamber, lit by the last breath of the fire, the king's body trembled once more, then stilled. The wind outside roared on, as indifferent to the passing of a monarch as to the fall of snow.
By dawn, the frost on the castle stones had turned silver in the pale light. Inside, the corridors of the keep felt strangely hollowed. The king's chamber, once a place of restless motion, footsteps, whispers, commands, was now silent except for the muted shuffle of attendants preparing the body. They had stripped the bed, removing the sweat-soaked linens that clung like a shroud. Gilbert oversaw the washing, his own face drawn and colorless. The king's skin had taken on a waxen pallor, the lines of pain now fixed into an almost serene mask. Only the faint swelling of his abdomen and the dark tinge at the lips hinted at the violent struggle of the night before. The king's physicians worked with cold precision, but even they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them muttered about the stomach being too hot, too swollen, and another whispered of corruption inside. But when a servant crossed himself and mentioned the lampreys aloud, the physicians went quiet, their eyes darting toward the bishop as if the word itself could summon scandal. In the great hole, word spread faster than the fire in the hearth. The lampreys had killed the king, some swore it. Others whispered of a more deliberate hand, a poison hidden in the feast by an enemy who knew Henry's appetite. These tales wove themselves together, growing richer and darker with each retelling. By midday, the first couriers rode out carrying the news to every corner of the realm. Some carried official proclamations of a peaceful passing. Others carried more dangerous stories, the kind that could turn loyalty to suspicion. The body was prepared for its journey, embalmed as best the age allowed. Yet in the cold air of the chamber, the scent of herbs barely masked the underlying sweetness of decay. It was said that the surgeons removed the king's entrails and buried them in Rouen to prevent the rot from spreading during transport. The rest of him would be carried across the sea to England. On the quay at Barfleur, the coffin stood beneath a canopy, guarded by men in black surcoats. Fishermen who had seen the king alive now crossed themselves at the sight of the bier, whispering prayers against bad luck. The sea wind carried the sharp smell of salt and tar, and to some, it seemed, the faint echo of a banquet long past. The ship that bore him home cut through gray waters, its sails taut against the wind.
Those aboard swore that on certain nights during the crossing, the crew heard the sound of a banquet, the clinking of goblets, the tearing of meat, though no food was served. In Westminster, preparations for burial began before the coffin arrived. The abbey was draped in black cloth, candles burning in endless rows. The nobles arrived dressed in mourning, their expressions carefully schooled. Though in private, some were already discussing the balance of power, the inheritance, the next king. When the coffin was carried into the abbey, the chanting of the monks rose like a tide. But even in this sacred space, the lampreys were not forgotten. Some of the common folk who crowded the steps whispered to their children. It was the Eels that took the king. Others warned, it was pride. Pride killed him. Thus the king was laid to rest, not simply as Henry, ruler of England, but as Henry, the monarch, who feasted too deeply, whose last indulgence became his legend. And in the years to come, whenever lampreys were served at a noble's table, someone would always lower their voice and say, "Do you not know? This was the dish that killed a king."
Centuries have passed since Henry I's coffin was lowered into the earth, yet his final meal has never been forgotten. In the minds of those who tell the tale, it is no longer just a plate of lampreys, it has become a symbol, a warning. In the candlelit halls of medieval England, the story was whispered not only as a curiosity, but as a lesson that no crown can shield a man from his appetites. Kings are not undone by swords alone. Sometimes it is the feast that delivers the fatal blow. And here we are, in an age of glass towers and glowing screens, thinking ourselves beyond such old follies. We trade lampreys for luxuries of another kind, rare delicacies, costly excess, the quiet indulgences we defend as harmless. Yet the hunger is the same. It is the urge to take more than we need, to believe we are immune to the limits of our own bodies. Henry's death was not only the end of a reign, but a mirror held up to every generation that followed. It reflects the truth that the most dangerous hungers are not born in the stomach, but in the mind, the part of us that will not be satisfied even when the table is full. The king is long gone, but the hunger that killed him, it is still seated at the table, waiting for us.